Hello and welcome back, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to be exploring the broad area of psychology that we call personality psychology. And in doing this, what we're going to be doing is expanding upon some of the work we talked about in our previous class. For clarification, in our last lecture, we watched a presentation discussing the very controversial work of an early, we might call personality psychologist, and also called clinical psychologist, Sigmund Freud. We looked at some of the concepts that he introduced and tried to explain better his kind of situation and contributions to the field of personality psychology and clinical psychology as a whole. In this class, we're going to be looking at what happened after Freud. And we're going to be doing this through the exploration of several early theorists in personality psychology that reshaped the conversation on personality and introduced their own terminology and approaches that still persist today for individuals studying personality from a number of different angles. And to start things off, we're going to be looking at somebody that for a long period of time was actually considered Freud's equivalent. In fact, for a long period of time, this individual, whose name is Carl Jung, was prized as Freud's heir apparent at the Psychodynamic Institute in Vienna that we spoke about in our previous class. Freud had given him lots of different titles and essentially groomed him to eventually replace him when he was going to retire. And for a long period of time, Carl Jung was on board with this idea. But as Freud's theories and ideas got to the more outlandish things that we started discussing in our previous class, focused a lot on sex and focused a lot on some of the early childhood things that disrupted the way we interacted with others, Jung started to grow uncomfortable with these new twists and turns in that psychodynamic approach. Early on, what he did was just, supplant these tiny comments and hints that maybe not everybody was on board with Freud. But in the latter portions of his career, he actually published a book which flat out rejected a lot of the notions that Freud had surmised in his work. He contended in this publication that this idea of the unconscious with Freud's was completely wrong. He contended that our hidden mind wasn't just about sex and all these childhood traumas that we'd experienced, but instead it was more of a focus on something future focused and also something spiritual in nature. And to explain his idea, Jung introduced this new concept of something that he called archetypes. These theoretical perspectives and kind of beings and entities that we had theoretically passed down to us from our ancestors that shaped not only the ways that we interacted with the world around us, but also the ways we saw the world around us. Some of these archetypes were grand ideas that shaped large portions of the way we separated out the world. Others were based on specific characters, like the Joker or the obedient dog. And he was very insistent that these things were not things that we just learned through our stories and our literature, but they were instead things that were passed down to us through something called the collective unconscious. And these ideas of Jung's, even though they were approached with the same scientific rigor that Freud had introduced, were embraced by a large number of individuals as the first alternative to Freud's concept of where individual differences and maybe even where some psychological problems were actually coming from. This spiritual take of Jung's also eventually led to him sort of spiraling out of control and having lots of issues in his latter academic careers. But if we're looking at a big contribution of Jung's, it was the fact that he started this new conversation of maybe not approaching personality psychology or clinical psych through the perspective of Freud's, but still exploring uncharted territory that psychologists had not gone to before. And what he really did for personality psychologists was open the door for others to come up with their own ideas and concepts about where our personality was forming. One theorist that rushed through this open door that Jung created was another former student of Freud's named Alfred Adler. He, like Jung, had grown uncomfortable with Freud's seemingly obsession with sex and some of his more outlandish ideas about how to help individuals with a variety of different problems. He also felt very uncomfortable with this notion of the id and the superego and an individual being split up in all these different ways that Freud and both Jung had surmised. So Adler decided, when he was trying to form his new branch of personality psychology, to focus his attention on just how a person saw themselves as a whole. He coined the term individual psychology to explain how his approach to personality was different from Freud and Jung's. In individual psychology approaches to personality, he said we should focus on how somebody defines themselves to others as a whole, not the broken up components that eventually make that person who they are. His argument was that all of us essentially have a story about ourselves, a script that we use in our minds to kind of explain how and why we do the things we do. And within that idea of us having this script is also this tendency for us to have a relatively positive perspective of ourselves and to want others to see us in this positive light as well. So he insisted within this perspective of who we are, we also have two major things that push us in different directions and get individual differences to start to emerge. The first thing that he focused on was this need to what he called strive for superiority. In a nutshell, what he contended with this was that when we have something that we recognize we're good at, we start to pursue those things to get others to see us in a positive light. While we're doing this, he contended that we're also trying to overcome any feelings of inferiority through things that we find ourselves lacking in. Well, let's say, for example, you've got a young child who sits in an art class and finds out that this person is drawing better than a lot of their peers. Well, this child might start to, because of this desire to be seen as superior, embrace these art skills in a way that maybe they weren't really caring about before they recognized this discrepancy. They might start to talk about how being artistic really defines them and how artistic people have these amazing characteristics to them. And granted, a young child might not be able to articulate it the same way an adult could, but in Adler's mind, this could be a byproduct of that identification of the child. And if that same child recognizes that they're not necessarily great in any athletics, they might start to push themselves away from those endeavors. They might start to not only define themselves as somebody that's not athletic, but also discount the need for athleticism in general. And eventually, after many successive years, those things won't start to form the personality of these individuals. And if we follow this all the way down the line, it could potentially explain the ebbs and flows and the things we pursue in life that eventually become what we think of as our personality. Adler's idea was very unique from the work of Freud and Jung's in that his focus was on things happening on the surface level. He contended that we didn't need to explore this hidden mind or unconscious through spiritual or sex-driven goals. Instead, he said most of our individual differences are happening right in front of us. And we can recognize clearly why we chose one door over the other as we were advancing in life. And this new notion that things happening on the surface could explain personality, how we could find a simple explanation for how we became the person we became, was a new breakthrough in personality psychology. And again, led to new individuals and ideas that started to be introduced in the field. Many of those individuals we unfortunately don't have time to cover in a class like this. But I do want to talk about another individual that sort of contrasted with the work of Freud and some of the assumptions that Freud had when he wanted to understand both clinical and personality psychology. And this individual's name is Carl Rogers. Rogers is considered by many to be one of the founding fathers of both personality and clinical psych, even though his work came many decades after the work of Freud. And the reason why people tout him as being one of the founding fathers of these areas was because his new ideas of where personality and mental health problems were coming from were such a contrast to Freud's that it started a discussion for decades about what really did work physically in terms of helping people and understanding where people were coming from. And this contrasting view of Rogers is often defined as what's called the humanistic approach to psychology. It's this assumption that people are inherently good. And what happens to them is that they pursue all these things that can allow them to contribute to society and become the best person they can become, but society tends to get in the way. It leads us down paths that maybe aren't ideal, and it causes issues, rifts in our personality, and potentially even mental health issues. To better explain where these mental health issues were, he started describing this difference between what he called the actual and ideal self of an individual. How theoretically we have this goal in mind of what we want to pursue and what would make us the best contributors to society. This would be what we call our ideal self, and how we often come into situations realizing that sometimes we're not meeting those ideals, either because we haven't developed certain skills or we have other constraints put on us that prevent us from being that ideal person. This notion of the self and things happening on the surface probably reminds you a little bit of the work of Adler's. But at the heart of Rogers' theory, which is very different from all the other ones, was again this inherent assumption that we're all pretty darn good people. Adler sort of saw personality as a byproduct of this battle to be the king of the hill. If we look at Freud, we saw personality really as a byproduct of all these traumas and carnal urges that we had. It's tough to pinpoint what Jung's theory was in terms of whether or not we saw people as positive or negative, but there was no assumption that people were inherently good in any of these early theories. Rogers was insistent that people left on their own volitions would be very wonderful contributors to society. And the thing that, again, was preventing them from doing that was the things that they encountered. So he talked about how people would try to accomplish things and maybe fall short because, again, they hadn't developed skills or had things that were impeding them, and it resulted in this issue with what he called self-efficacy, this kind of recognition of what we can and can't accomplish in our goals and the things that we're striving to become. But he said if we could get all the assistance we need, not only could our mental health get better, not only would our personality kind of resonate with who we truly are, but it would also result in this amazing spiritual-like thing that he called self-actualization. This moment where our ideal and actual selves are aligned and all of these other amazing things come in tow. You might be asking now, what are these amazing things that come in tow? To understand that, we have to understand the work of one of Rogers' colleagues over the years. And this gentleman's name was Abraham Maslow. Maslow was the architect for a really interesting idea that complemented the theories of Rogers's. Maslow contended that as people were pursuing self-actualization, trying to become this great person, what they needed to do first was overcome all these inherent needs that could occupy our time and energy. He thought that many individuals in the beginning might not even think about pursuing any of their goals or trying to reach self-actualization if, say, we don't have any physiological needs met. If we're lacking in air or water or have to go to the bathroom, any of these things, probably not thinking much about how to get that ideal and actual self aligned, how to become this spiritual, enlightened being. And he said if we can get that taken care of, we don't get to just think about how self-actualization. We can start worrying about the next level, what he called our safety needs. Do we feel like our health is intact? Do we feel like we're not going to be robbed or have something horrible happen to us? If those needs are met, is that we can move up the ramp, or up the ladder, I guess you could say, to the need to be loved, to feel like we belong. If that's taken care of, we can worry about esteem. But his insistence was, with this hierarchy of needs, that this was an ever-changing thing. So we might be working on esteem, almost getting to the point of self-actualization when our stomach grumbles, or we suddenly feel like we're not in a neighborhood that we're comfortable in. And all of a sudden our mind starts to become occupied with these things. Maslow's insistence was that sometimes when certain needs need to be met, not only can we not worry about self-actualization, but the fixation on trying to find a way to take care of those needs could develop into what we consider personality characteristics, consistencies within us. This, what we call hierarchy of needs, again, complemented the work of Rogers in showing where sometimes society and other things led us astray down the path to self-actualization. But Maslow, in working with Rogers, did contend that many people do find a way to take care of these needs, to get all of this stuff adjusted for in their life, and in doing so, they can become self-actualized and develop these both spiritual and kind of mindful experiences where everything comes easier, they're much more productive, they're much happier, they're more humorous, and all of these kind of unusual personality characteristics start to all coalesce with each other and allow the person to not only pursue those things that they're going after, but really be those amazing contributors to society that Rogers was talking about. And it's important to know, before we leave Rogers and Maslow, how important these two individuals were to the conversation in personality psychology. They gave us kind of a different perspective on individual differences, on human nature in general. They gave clinical psychologists an alternative to the Freudian approach that had persisted for nearly 2 decades at this point. And it eventually led to individuals picking sides about whether or not they wanted to follow the path of Rogers or follow the path of Adler or Jung or Freud. And it started to create this really compartmentalized area of psychology and personality. For a long period of time, people did get taught in a personality class the different camps of personality that existed and had to sort of pick one that they wanted to follow in their attempts to understand individual differences. And that was persistent for a number of decades. And it wasn't actually until around the 1960s, 1970s that conversation started to change. And if we're looking for what really was the catalyst for that change, it was the introduction of a new approach to personality psychology that finally attempted, for the very first time, to be less about theory and more about the science that a lot of the other branches of psychology were pursuing at the time. This new approach to personality is called by many the social cognitive model of personality psychology. Now, that seems like a mouthful, but it really does give a clear description of what personality psychologists using this approach did. This idea, this approach, surmises that our personality is not a byproduct of us trying to be this spiritual individual or these hidden things within our mind or anything else that we've talked about, but instead, it's simply a byproduct of what we've learned. And what we've learned comes from our interactions, the social world that we've exposed ourselves in. And the things we've learned are things like how to see the world around us, how to perceive it, how to recognize what we might want to get out of a situation, how to come up with ways to get those things, and how to interpret all of the different things around us as we're going through those encounters. One of my favorite examples of how this approach works is actually depicted in the far side caption that you see to your right. It might seem sort of unrelated, but I promise this really does epitomize what the social cognitive model of personality is all about. You see in it all these individuals practicing martial arts, working on the skills, trying to figure out when to enact these skills. And then something happens in the environment that seems to fit those skill sets well. And suddenly we activate them. We get into those situations, immediately trying to overcome those situations or those encounters with the skills that we've learned to develop. This is obviously a pretty blunt, obvious situation, but theoretically, many personality psychologists using this approach argue this is what we think of when we see the environment on a regular basis. When somebody's learned to see the world as filled with conflict, will often find lots of situations relating to the conflict that they've expected to see. Those that see the world as filled with opportunities to make friends and to explore new relationships will often come into lots of situations perceiving them as ways to make new friends, to explore new friendships. Others that have a spiritual take or a religious take might see many experiences as a way to impart their religious beliefs or kind of explore their religious mentality in those environments. And those things become the definition of who we are. As I mentioned, though, the social cognitive model of personality was not just a new take on personality. It was the very first moment where we started to merge personality approaches with concrete research that other people in psychology were doing at the time. One of the first prominent early social cognitive theorists was a gentleman named Albert Bandura, who spent a large portion of his career trying to set the framework for some of the terms and concepts that could explain where a lot of our early childhood behaviors that eventually led to adulthood behaviors linked to personality came from. One of the terms that Bandura is often tied to is this concept of something called modeling. Something sort of built off a lot of the behavioral principles that we've spoken about in previous classes. In modeling, what children do when they develop their personality characteristics and the things that they decide to pursue is they build their repertoire off of their adults or parents that they encounter on a regular basis. One of the more classic and prominent studies that was ever done by Bandura was this one that we nowadays call the Bobo doll experiment. In this study, he brought children into a viewing room, and these children watched an adult model do one of two things. In one situation, the adult model went into a room filled with toys, and proceeded to play very quietly and politely with all of the toys. In the other condition, depicted in the image that you see above, well, sort of depicted in the image that you see above, I see it slightly cut off, the model acted very violently toward a specific thing called a Bobo doll. This inflatable doll with sand on the bottom of it that allows it to continue standing and being hit over and over again and eventually finding its way upright. In the video that these children watched, the woman pinned the Bobo doll down, punched it, said some mean aggressive things to it, and kicked it. Then the children were allowed, in both conditions, to go into this same room that they had seen the model acting in and play with all the toys in the room. What Bandura wanted to see was not only how many children would replicate the behavior of this model, this woman that they were watching, but also add to that repertoire that she displayed. And what Bandura showed very clearly in this study is that the children that had watched her act aggressively toward the Bobo doll immediately started replicating that behavior when they were allowed into the room. He also noted in several iterations of the study that these children who not only were replicating the behavior of the model, also expanded upon this violence in different ways. Many of them were drawn to guns that were in the room and other violent objects like hammers in ways that the children who had not seen her act violently were drawn to. He also said that they picked up novel language and found ways to embellish upon the things that this woman, this model, was originally doing. One of my favorite examples of some of the creative things that the kids did is actually depicted in the picture in the lower right-hand corner. You can't see it, but the little girl is actually at that moment holding a doll, a play doll, and is about to hit that Bobo doll in the head with the play doll. Now, Bandura's argument was that many of these children in this experiment probably didn't become violent people as a result of being exposed to this one situation. But he surmised that if these kids were found in violent environments on a regular basis, they would start to replicate these behaviors enough until it became a part of their repertoire, until they started to see the world as more violent and tended to try to solve lots of their problems with violence. His insistence was that this is not just for violence, but for lots of different behaviors that we start to establish as children and that carry over with us throughout our life. The big message from his work on modeling was that if we're looking for where our personality is coming from, there's a really good chance it's a byproduct of the people around us that we see acting and the way they're acting. Another major prominent theorist in this social cognitive movement was a gentleman named Walter Mischel. While Bandura focused his attention on the skills that we develop as a result of who we see, Mischel focused his attention on the thoughts that we develop in the different environments that we find ourselves in. He surmised through his work and large amounts of studies that when children learn things, what they're often learning is how to interpret things and how to expect certain outcomes from the situations they found themselves in. He also said that as a result of these interpretations, we start to devise skill sets that allow us to produce outcomes that we want and also produce outcomes that we want to avoid. These skill sets we develop, he called competencies. And all this can come together in very interesting examples. One of my favorite ones that I've ever come across was this example that I believe Mischel actually gave to compare and contrast individuals that describe themselves as extroverts or introverts. We can say, for example, if you were an extrovert and you heard about an upcoming party, odds are pretty good that very specific thoughts would come to mind when hearing about this party. You'd think about the individuals that you'd get to meet. You'd think about the ways that you could maybe have fun in this situation. And you could probably think of all the different ways to kind of see this as a chance at a social gathering. And all of these perspectives, all of these takes on the situation itself, then shape the different competencies that you decide to display when you find yourself at that party. If you're thinking about ways to meet large numbers of individuals, you're going to do lots of things that could potentially allow this to happen. You're going to be louder. You're going to be more active. You're going to be more outgoing. You're going to make sure that you've got a network of people around you so you can maximize your chance of meeting more people. And if we contrast this with an introvert, we can see again how important expectations, interpretations are. If an introvert hears about a party, they probably immediately think about the potential for embarrassment or the stress that that specific experience might induce based on their maybe past experiences or past ways they've learned to look at that situation. And if you approach a situation thinking that it's going to be stressful or that we need to avoid problems, well, you display a completely different set of competencies in that situation. You're going to hide or avoid eye contact or find excuses not to go in general. And in doing so, kind of, display the things that we link to introverts in the first place. It's important to note here that Mischel's focus was not on the behaviors themselves. His focus was on the things that led up to those behaviors that we display, insisting that our competencies were just really a byproduct of what we'd thought of, what ideas came to mind when we found ourselves in a specific situation. And his argument was that once these competencies are activated, and they've been established for years, it creates this self-fulfilling prophecy where we start to become that person we maybe originally just had a small inclination toward being. One of his classic studies that highlight how this worked was his research on a topic that we called the ability to delay gratification. In this landmark study that Mischel conducted multiple decades ago, he placed young children in front of a plate with a marshmallow on it. And he told them, look, I'm going to leave this room for a few minutes. And if you can resist this marshmallow placed in front of you for that time span that I'm gone, I'm going to come back with a second marshmallow and give it to you. And then you can have both marshmallows when you leave the experiment. But if you can't resist the temptation, if you have to eat the marshmallow, you just eat it and realize that you won't get the second one when I return. Now, this seems like a pretty straightforward study. But what Michelle was able to show was that at around the age of 5, there was already a wide range in interpretations of the situation and abilities displayed between the kids that he looked at. Some children saw this as a challenge or a fun game. Others saw this as an insurmountable problem. Others saw it as an annoyance. And based on those perceptions, they tried to tackle the approach in different ways. For the ones that were annoyed, they tried to find ways to sort of cheat the system by taking tiny bites out of the marshmallow or finding ways to sneak little tastes of it without thinking that Michelle could see him. Others would sometimes, in their attempts to make it a game, do things that kind of made the situation more fun. They'd move around, they'd dance, they'd smile, they'd sing to themselves. Others who saw it as a challenge would find ways to distract themselves or really find ways to kind of keep themselves resisting the marshmallow. And the last group that saw it as an insurmountable task would often just take the marshmallow and shove it in their mouth before Michelle had even left. Now again, when we think of personality, we often think of the behaviors. But Michelle's insistence was, for these kids, it was the way they saw the situation that dictated the behaviors they displayed. And he suggested, and later found, that this was not just one isolated incident. Most of the kids that were able to delay gratification of the marshmallow, he was able to tie to them also delaying gratification in other aspects of their lives. Many of these kids were described as more popular by their parents and teachers. Many of them had actually been very successful in the early years of school. And also, many of them had displayed this ability to kind of hold in their emotions and get better things, even at a very young age. The ones that could not delay the gratification were described by their parents and teachers and potentially peers as more temperamental, a little bit more difficult to be around, and ones that definitely caused lots of angst and frustration for those around them. And not only did Michelle find this at this young age, but he had graduate students and others that followed these people for years when they originally participated in this study. And what they consistently found was not a perfect correlation between what children did at the age of 5 and what they did as adults, but a pretty darn high one, where they could usually reliably predict that if somebody was able to delay a marshmallow, or I guess avoid a marshmallow for a short period of time, they were probably also more likely to be successful in college, where you required years of work before you get to the end product. They were probably more successful in being able to find a partner that wasn't just physically attractive or funny and somebody they wanted to be around, but somebody that was compatible with them. And they could find ways to kind of pursue different aspects in life that maybe required more work, but gave a greater payout in the end. And those that could not delay gratification, well, they were often found in their adulthood pursuing these things that were very impulse-based. They struggled in school, in relationships. They struggled with drugs. They struggled with other things. Again, it wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't that Michelle suggested that we knew exactly who you were going to be as an adult by the time you were 5 with just one simple marshmallow test. But his suggestion was that there was lots of implications for what we encountered in childhood, how we started to learn to perceive the world, that continued throughout our life. And his highlight, his focus again, was how important our thoughts are when we talk about where our personality and our skill sets that we call competencies actually come from. And the idea of the social cognitive perspective, I think, is a great place to close out this class, because it allows us to see where lots of personality psychologists started to go in the latter portion of the 1900s. If we're looking back at all the theorists that we've talked about before, what you'll see is a common underpinning. Almost all early personality psychologists wanted to understand what made us who we were. Want to understand the sources of our personality, but the way they attacked it for a very long period of time was to just pick a camp and a theory and go with it. trying to find all the subtle nuances that explained it. The social cognitive movement started to change that discussion. It gave people a path to explore this wide-ranging field of personality in a scientific manner, even if it was still trying to understand the source of our personality in the first place. This idea is something we're going to keep with us when we get into our next class and look at another area of personality psychology that was forming at about the same time as this social cognitive approach, but one that was trying to answer a different question, namely not what causes us to have these individual differences, but how we can quantify these and what they mean for us in terms of things like our success in school and longevity and overall happiness with life. This is what we're going to explore when we get into the world of traits in our next class. But hopefully now, after what we've covered, you have a better sense of how we got to where we are today in personality psychology. Please be sure in our next class that you've read through all the material and understand all the previous theorists, because that will allow you to understand the research behind trait psychology significantly better. I encourage you to explore all the different psychologists at your school that do study personality and try to link them up to some of the different early trait theories or early personality theories, I guess, that were out there. And what you'll find is that oftentimes we do have a starting point that leads us down a certain path, sort of like the social cognitive model suggests. And eventually, you'll have a better understanding of not only what allows some of our personality researchers to study what they study, but how we can study personality as a whole in this branch of psychology. We'll again be closing out these ideas of personality theories in our next class. So until then, take care, and I'll see you soon.